Welcome to Undertold Verbatim. I'm Solveig Rennan for the Undertold Stories Project. We report from all over the world for PBS NewsHour on the consequences of poverty and the work of change agents addressing them. We've done extended interviews with hundreds of experts and people making a difference in their communities. In this podcast, we're revisiting those undertold stories so you can hear changemakers around the world in their own words. This is Undertold Verbatim. Minneapolis is a culinary city. In one block, you can eat jerk chicken at a Jamaican dance hall, grab a farm-to-table brunch, and have Greek, Malaysian, or Mexican food for dinner. But the food with the longest history here doesn't have a seat at the table. Colonialism erased indigenous traditions like music, language, and art. But the loss of native culinary heritage has starved generations of their physical health and cultural identity.
Around here, you can't get more Minnesotan than those foods because they've been here longer than Minnesota was a concept.
While training as a chef, Shawn Sherman learned French, Italian, and other Western styles of cooking, but he had no way of knowing what his ancestors ate. So he decided to find out himself. His cookbook, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, won a James Beard Award in 2018. Today, he and his partner Dana Thompson run the Sioux Chef, a project to revive indigenous traditions in the kitchen and encourage cheaper and healthier eating for everyone.
What started you down this path?
That's Fred, the reporter.
Of going from being someone who just worked in a restaurant because that's where you landed, to just support yourself, to embracing food?
Well, a lot of it was...
That's Shawn, the chef.
For me personally, growing up in the restaurant industry, starting in restaurants when I was 13, moving to Minneapolis after coming from South Dakota, and working my way up into an executive chef position and playing chef for a few different restaurants, and really growing a lot, educating myself on a lot of cuisines. I didn't go to cooking school, so it was just a lot of self-education on trying to figure out how to make all these foods. So I learned a lot of course, European foods, Spanish, Italian, French, you name it. And partway into my chef career, I just kind of had this epiphany moment of realizing that Minneapolis was a cool food scene. There was food from all over the place, and the neighborhood I lived in, you can find it all just a few blocks away, just all this different cuisines you could choose from. And it just all of a sudden I realized like there was no native food, so I just realized the utter absence of indigenous perspective anywhere in the culinary world. So, because there was just nothing that represented the land we were actually standing on. And having been born on a tribal community and being an enrolled member with the Oglala Lakota Sioux, I just thought about like how much was lost. I thought about like what I didn't know, because I started looking at myself and I knew very little about Lakota recipes, and I started looking around and trying to figure out what were my Lakota ancestors eating and storing away? What were they growing? How are they getting oils and salts and fats and sugars and things like that? And just trying to figure out all of this from a culinary perspective. So it took me quite a few years of just researching, but it really became a passion because I saw as I learned about my historical and ancestral foods, I also was learning a lot of history and realizing like how much damage was done to indigenous communities across North America, and of course around the world when you look at a colonial history everywhere. But just seeing like, by understanding how much was lost, I was able to see like how much we could build and put back together.
Was there any particular trigger for that, or was it a gradual kind of realization?
After one particularly hard restaurant job, chef job, I moved down to Mexico, and I lived in a tiny little beach town on the Nayarit coast, and I became really interested in the indigenous peoples that were living there and selling a lot of their art. They were the Huicholes, and I just started researching and read about the Huichol and their history, and thinking about their food, and then that's kind of when it dawned on me. Really, it was just like, oh, because there was so much commonality between these people and where I grew up on Pine Ridge around Lakota people and my family. I could see it in the mannerisms and the humor. I can see it, and I just thought like, oh, we're just like really distant cousins, basically, when it comes down to it, you know, through space and time, of course. But really, just realizing like we had this deep connection as Indigenous peoples, and I started thinking about that. Then I started thinking about I wanted to learn more about my own ancestry, but there was very little knowledge and information on Indigenous foods anywhere. It seemed to be completely invisible for the most part. So it just sent me on a path to try and understand as much as possible, you know, and digging through all this historical, archaeological, ethnobotanical, and just looking for a culinary perspective and everything, and trying to build my own vision of what I thought Indigenous foods could and should be.
And you didn't have any kind of formal education, certainly in the culinary arts?
No, I did not. I went to school in Spearfish, South Dakota at Black Hills State University, and my focuses were more business orientated. So cooking was something I just had always done because I started working basically out of necessity, because coming from a reservation, my mom was just raising my sister and myself, and I was the oldest, and I started working right away. So I just jumped into restaurants, and I had a really good, strong work ethic, so I excelled at whatever I did in the kitchens and just moved my way up. And after moving all through high school and college, working kitchens, and then moving to a city in Minneapolis, was able to grow really fast.
So walk us briefly through some of the steps that, you know, where did you then go to uncover and discover what you now know, and talk about the evolution of the Sioux Chef.
I started really researching the plants, because in my mind I knew that my Indigenous ancestors and assumingly all Indigenous communities had a really strong connection with the plants around them. And part of it was identifying, you know, just what was the education for Indigenous peoples, which was basically thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down orally, you know, family member after family member, giving them the tools to live sustainably with plants around them. So there was so much with the plant knowledge was the biggest key to it, because not only was it the food, but it was also the medicine and the shelter and all those pieces. But being able to understand there's like all of this plant diversity that's just completely underutilized by the Western diet, you know, around us, especially here in North America, where we see so much, there's just so much, you know, so many plants out there. And of course I started digging through a lot of historical texts, trying to understand any kind of first accounts, but also realizing those accounts were usually very skewed, because usually they were from military point of view or religious point of view, and they were very much, you know, promoting their kind of colonial take. And also realizing how short in history a lot of this stuff happened too was a big part of it, you know.
It wasn't that long ago.
It was not long ago, because for me, I was born in 1974, so I think 100 years before my birth in 1874, my Lakota ancestors were still living on the plains traditional and had the full extent of the knowledge that they have always had at that point in time. They hadn't discovered gold in the Black Hills until 1876. Then things go really bad really quickly over quite a few short years, and there's many battles between the Lakota and the United States. So like my great-grandfather was born in the 1850s, and he was 18 during the Battle of Little Bighorn against General Custer. So I think about like how much information and knowledge was lost in such a short time period, and where did that happen? You know, so it started just looking at how assimilation efforts and boarding school systems really broke up a lot of our knowledge as Indigenous people, and really separated us even further from our food systems, even though we'd already lost a lot of land at that point. We'd already lost a lot of our resources. But the dismantling of our education system was probably the most damaging piece to it. So that's where I became really focused on trying to you know, really try to figure out what was lost so we can build that back. So, you know, asking a lot of elders any memories they had, but I really wish a lot of this work had started in my parents' generation, because there would have been a lot more elders alive with more direct memories, because some of the elders at that generation could have remembered directly a lot of this before it really went bad, you know, before the commodity food program and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk briefly about that, about the corruption of the diet, if that's the right, you know, word for it, that came with settlers, with colonization?
Well, personally, like I grew up with the commodity food program, you know, which was a program started in the 1930s to help poor families and which included a lot of reservations. And then, today we still have a form of that, and a lot of families still surviving off of government commodity foods. But it's, unfortunately, has never been much of a nutritional program. So we see a lot of food and health disparity, especially amongst tribal regions. So we can see what happens to entire generations at this point when this is their sole source or their main source of nutrition, and you're using a food that is just government staples of wheat flour and corn product and oversaturated fats and just overprocessed foods in general. And the immensity, when you have a community with over 60% type 2 diabetes today, there's something wrong with the food system. So looking at how healthy indigenous foods were in the past, and seeing that we could actually bring a lot of health back through foods was a big part of the drive for what we do today. Because indigenous diets are just so clean, they're hyper-local and hyper-regional because we're using an immense amount of plant diversity, a lot of wild game, a lot of seeds and nuts. But for indigenous peoples, especially here in North America, we didn't have to worry about obesity or heart disease or type 2 diabetes or even tooth decay because of the low glycemic level of our foods. So a lot of this work is trying to make something right that is awfully wrong still today. And it's hard because a lot of these families who have been using a lot of these staples as their comfort base of foods, and then supplementing that with gas station foods or fast foods. That's all they have access to. So we really want to create a system that can create access to healthy indigenous foods that would be particular to these people all across the board.
Mm-hmm. So you've had your epiphany, you've discovered that this can be a means of restoring health, and so you start evolving this idea called the Sioux Chef. Tell us a little bit about how that moniker came to be, and talk about the evolution of your larger business model, if that's the right expression for it.
So I started the company, the Sioux Chef, in 2014, but it had taken quite a few years to get to that point. And I wanted to do something that was really featuring regional indigenous foods and cutting out colonial ingredients that didn't exist here not that long ago. So right away, removing dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, just processed foods in general, even removing beef, pork, and chicken, and just looking at what were the diets of these particular regions. So starting the Sioux Chef with that focus of just trying to focus on just this hyper-local area to really represent what were the, searching for the indigenous pantries basically, and trying to see how many foods we can come up with those items. Looking for corns and beans and squash and sunflower. And I really at the beginning just wanted to start a restaurant because I thought it would be a great platform to be able to bring so much awareness to this out there. And part of what we also wanted to do was support indigenous food producers. So I wanted to find as many indigenous food producers as possible so we could purchase from them first. And then I was purchasing from local growers around us who were helping to growing a lot of indigenous food because it's all around us. You get sunchokes and maple and dandelions and all sorts of stuff. And we weren't trying to recreate a cuisine that happened in, say, 1491. We were just trying to understand as much as we could from our ancestors and the knowledge that they had to be able to make this food authentic, but also knowing we're in a different world now. And there's a lot of different plant species around us that weren't there before. So looking at foods with an indigenous perspective and really thinking about especially these wild plants, instead of trying to say, I can't use that because it's not indigenous, it's accepting it because what's the purpose of this plant? Is it edible? Is it medicinal? Can you do something with it? And usually it's all three. So using dandelions and purslanes and anything that might have been introduced later, we could absorb that still into the diet, but just keeping it really clean. My partner here, Dana Thompson, she came on really early. And we saw the immense potential, of course, of what we could do, and we just started, jumping into it. And we're right on the cusp of getting ready to open up our first big brick and mortar, this Indigenous Food Lab concept we have to help bring more awareness and really do this right.
Mm-hmm. Pick it up from there, Dana. You joined this initiative. What have been the biggest challenges? What's exciting and what's challenging at the same time?
Well, we immediately started getting a lot of attention.
That's Dana Thompson, Shawn's partner and chief operating officer of the Sioux Chef brand.
And started to get a lot of attention from tribal communities as well. We're popping up on their radar and getting emails, and almost immediately a challenge was that we weren't able to visit every tribal community that reached out to us. So we had to say no to a lot of people, which was really hard for us. And that really inspired us to understand that we have to think really critically about how we're going to expand this model and get more partners on so that we can reach more tribal communities in a faster fashion. And I have to say that everything that we imagine happening has basically happened. All of our wildest dreams, basically. Just being able to bring on more people from tribal communities onto our catering team specifically, and to develop them and to help continue to create ways for them to learn the fundamentals of these indigenous foods so they can apply that to their own ancestral history. That's a huge part of our vision, and it's been working. And another example of that is to have the book published so that we could take all that knowledge that was in Shawn's brain and put it into something that we could share with communities and could be used as a resource. And then, it went so far as to be on all these top 10 lists for the best cookbooks of the year and to win the James Beard Award. It's just beyond our wildest dreams, in a sense.
But at the community level, where you're looking for absorption, if you will, meaning people taking this into their kitchens,
right.
And eating, what have the challenges been? How has that gone?
Incredibly well. Shawn is just a phenomenal, he's a visionary. And he also happens to have this incredible talent of being really soft-spoken and articulate and able to communicate with people from all different demographics. He's just incredibly relatable, just naturally.
But the question is, to actually get this into people's kitchens as an idea is a challenge, is it not? I mean, how do people afford access to many of these ingredients?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is that people can just go into their backyards and get quite a few of them, which is kind of an epiphany.
Cutting out those colonial ingredients was a big key to it, but using a lot of the plants around us. So a lot of this stuff, people are afraid at first when we've had that before where people say, well, I don't know if I'd be able to find anything. And we're like, literally, you just go outside, it's right there. So if you need some cedar, you find a cedar tree, because some of these foods are not commodified. They're not, just order them online from a big, online distributor. You have to spend some time searching some of these flavors because there's so many plants around us that people just weren't using. We're in this region where we have so much wild rice that comes out of these pure lakes, and people, it's a big thing, it's going on right now, so they're out there harvesting right now. And a lot of families are able to create a lot of staples off of that. And we're trying to entice people to be outdoors more and start to collect a lot of these foods that were ancestral foods for us as Indigenous communities. And each region is unique and special, and we have this vision of helping to create Indigenous restaurants, and just thinking how amazing it would be to drive across North America in any direction, east to west, north to south, whichever, stopping at Indigenous food businesses along the way, and you could really start to see that diversity, because a few hundred miles or so, there's going to be different language, different history, different religions, and different food and flavors and everything right there, and we can showcase that through the food. As today we live in such a homogenous kind of focus, we have very little plant diversity in our diets, and you basically find the exact same food across the board. So every time you pull over, if you're driving across the country, you're going to see the same hamburger, the same soda, everything's the same. And that consistency obviously is great and fine, but there's so much diversity we could be celebrating, and there's so much diversity of Indigenous peoples just everywhere.
I don't think anybody would argue that any of these ingredients, the fresh produce, the things that you can pluck out of the wild or in your garden, are good for you. The question becomes, in a modern world, do people have time to do that, to even think in those terms? And so does it just seem a little daunting psychologically for a lot of folks to go out and do this when it's much simpler, when all you have ever done is gone to your neighborhood grocery store?
It's very possible, but we're just opening up a different perspective to people. For Indigenous peoples, they see it, they get it, and they want this to be a part of their community. And we want to help them to find those tools and resources to make that a thing, that could be a consistent thing for them, to be able to harvest things from the wild all the time, because that's how our Indigenous ancestors were eating. And for other people who are interested in that, people who might want to think outside the box literally, spend a little time outdoors. It wouldn't hurt anybody to spend a little time outdoors to learn the plants, And we should be, because the plant knowledge is so important, we should be learning about all the properties of these trees and plants around us and how much food is out there. And where it's not, if we can learn how to control that and sustainably harvest a lot of these pieces and not damage our environment and utilize a lot of plants that really want to grow well and not try to force other things.
A lot of people in this modern world would probably listen to you and say, yeah, but we need stuff produced at an industrial scale because there's 9 billion people on the planet, there's all of this. Do you think that there is that capacity and we're just not seeing it?
I think what was more important is really focusing on how a regional and community-based food system could be really important for our future, because we could be using our landscape better, number one, instead of like spending so much time on lawns and golf courses and things that are just kind of a, no offense, a waste of space. We could be thinking smartly, and we could be landscaping with purpose, and just putting food everywhere on all these open spaces. But we need, community kitchens and people who are trained in them to be able to process those foods. So for us, our work is trying to help build that infrastructure, especially for Indigenous communities. And if we can use some of these small Indigenous communities who can start to really grasp a true sense of food sovereignty and be able to create enough food for their own, that's going to make them extremely just better off for everything, for health, for economic prosperity, and just for cultural revitalization in general. And any community could really embrace that by spending time, but people have to work for it. They can't expect other people to supply their food for them constantly. If you want to create a system that works, people are going to have to actually be a part of it.
You just described a part of it, but Dana, what is this food infrastructure that you're trying to build, essentially, and describe the mechanics of putting all of that together, and how has that gone?
Well, we're at the point of just getting the Indigenous Food Lab up and running.
Can you talk a little bit about that too? What is an Indigenous Food Lab?
Essentially, it's the first one is going to open in Minneapolis, and it's going to be a culinary training center with offices for our nonprofit executive staff, and a commercial kitchen and a commissary kitchen, so that we'll be able to have a training restaurant where people can come in and learn about the fundamentals of the Indigenous food system and then take that knowledge back to their own communities to start their own small businesses. And we plan to have business plans and any kind of support that we can offer so that they succeed, essentially.
Part of the question was how can we get this food out there everywhere? Because we saw the need for it all over the place, in tribal communities all across the nation. So we wanted to figure out a system that we could do that. I saw, and using our skills, because I come from the food business. So how can I do something with what I know how to do? And looking at how could a corporate restaurant mimic itself, send out 200 stores in a very short time period, and be able to just get that out there, right? That message out there of whatever they might be doing. So I thought maybe we can utilize something like that to be able to spread awareness and to spread this food, because we really want to create a situation that pushes for a center where people can have access to Indigenous education, and also helping to create the infrastructure to create food access for people out there, for Indigenous food access. So we developed under NATIVS, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where this is where the Indigenous Food Lab is born. So we're using the Indigenous Food Lab as a nonprofit restaurant model where people will be able to come to the restaurant and try it and experience these foods, but it's going to be a training and classroom situation where we can offer a whole bunch of education and curriculum around Indigenous foods, everything from seed saving to farming techniques to wild foods and ethnobotany, cooking and culinary curriculum all over the place, food preservation, of course, even language, history, and even trauma, just dealing with some of this trauma and offering classes and groups around that too. So we want to create a place that just really focuses on education, but our goal is to work with the tribal communities nearby us, helping them to develop some kind of Indigenous kitchen for their community. It could be something as small as a catering operation for a community that doesn't have that many resources, or it can be as large as a full-scale restaurant if we have a community that has a lot of resources. But giving them the training in the kitchen to be able to maintain that, so we would train all of their workers through ourselves in the food lab, and then help them develop and design it to be particular to their tribe, their their community, their language, their history, their region, their flavors, and using all those pieces. And our goal is to be able to make this as a replicable model, so we would be able to open up Indigenous food labs in cities everywhere. So we could be in Seattle, Boston, Chicago, Denver, Albuquerque, Toronto, Anchorage, Mexico City. Each one could be a regional center point to work that education and training with the tribal communities around it, helping them to develop some kind of food system that would create healthy food and hopefully really bend the way people think about nutrition and health, and give the future generations of kids access, so when they're growing up, they're always going to be around their traditional foods, because that's one thing that's just missing, is just that access to those foods anywhere.
And that was part of my other question is, I mean, yes, you're encouraging people to grow their own food in their backyard, but is there not a need to develop a system in which the places where we buy food, like stores, have a better selection that is more accessible to people?
I think we're going to really be able to grow into that, because I think the growth could be really endless, you know. So if we can get communities who and entice people using those smaller kitchens as incubator kitchens to help develop more Indigenous food producers, they can start to help create, we can help them on the path to create products and to be able to plug them into these networks that we're building, and to be able to get them out there on the market, and to even eventually, you know, be able to, because like even if we could just get some of those gas stations out there in those really rural communities to just have one section, one shelf of healthy Indigenous options to choose from, you know, just take away one big shelf of chips, right, and just put a whole bunch of healthy foods there, when we can help Indigenous peoples market that.
Isn't it true that those chips would be a lot cheaper than the healthier options that might replace them?
Yep, but if we can help bring a little bit, if we can help bring economic prosperity back into tribal communities, create more food base, create a healthier community food base in general, so like a healthier Indigenous community food shelf, have more options to staples, because a lot of people up here should have access to things like wild rice and dried corns and dried squash and dried beans and all these staple foods that they'll be able to eat, you know, healthily eat. And while we're stuck with the commodity food program at this moment, you know, ideally we could take that over down the road, right? One thing we know what we have to do is really fix our food systems and fix just the trend we have towards bad diets, and to be a lot more preventative, and the Indigenous diet is just such a great answer.
And I just want to say about the chips being cheaper, it's cheaper on the front end, because if you look at all the health disparity, the statistics, it's out of this world, insane. If you eat these Indigenous foods, they're literally medicine. You're going to eliminate all those foodborne illnesses, and if you look at the costs of treating all of those foodborne illnesses, it wipes that price of the chips right out.
It's hard to see, though, if you're on a limited budget and want a quick snack or a piece of food. So that is ultimately the challenge, is it not?
And part of it is just being role models, especially as chefs, because we're showcasing a whole bunch of ways to use these foods, ways to access these foods, and different things. And we're hoping to see more chefs, you know, that come out of our group or other people around the nation, because this is kind of a movement happening. This push for Indigenous food sovereignty is happening all across the nation right now.
What's the hurdle in getting more adoption in many ways? Is it price? Is it marketing? Why, you know? What you're saying makes perfect sense. There isn't a doctor that would disagree. There isn't a public health official that would disagree. So what's the hurdle?
Our hurdle, you know, of course, you know, a lot of people who come from a tribal community, much like I did, you know, we were born without any money. Like any land and resources we had around were stripped from us long before we were born, basically. So we weren't born with a rich uncle or a rich father who could sign off on $1 million loan or something for us as we grow. So starting all of this from scratch, from the very base of it, you know, is something that a lot of Indigenous peoples would have to struggle. You know, so that's one of the biggest struggles, is just not being born with entitlement to be able to, you know, and having the monetary resources to be able to grow freely, even if we have a good idea. So a lot of this is setting a path for people out of this, because a lot of people like on our team particularly grew up just like I did. They grew up very poor in a tribal community. That, you know, they saw a lot of abuse, a lot of addiction, a lot of just issues in general growing up, and barely survived past that point. You know, barely survived not being in jail or incarcerated for long periods of time, or just being completely addicted to drugs or alcohol when it comes down to it. We are just trying to be a role model of showcasing a way we can get out of this. And a lot of what we're trying to do too is just become more resourceful, because our Indigenous ancestors didn't have the entitlement to be wasteful, so they couldn't just throw everything away. Like we throw so much away in today's society. We have enough food to actually feed the world a few times over, but we throw it all in the trash at a certain point, you know. So we want to be as resourceful as we can as we try to grow into new systems that could really help combat and battle that, you know. So there's a lot of gigantic hurdles, and we're not trying to fix the world in a couple of years. We're just trying to set ourselves on a right path to be really strong role models, to showcase a different perspective, but something that's always been there.
One of the hallmarks, and you were saying that today in your demonstration, was the simplicity, the simple elegance of so much of what you prepare. I come from a culture where, you know, if it doesn't take, you know, 17 ingredients and spices and take days to marinate, you know, it's just not worth it, kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about that discovery that, you know, it doesn't take a lot to make simply elegant, nutritious food.
Yeah, I looked at some of the recipes that I knew that were traditional, that were still handed down. So you look at things like, say, peaky bread from the Southwest. You know, you're basically using blue corn and a little bit of juniper ash, which adds a little bit of sodium and everything to it, and it kind of nixtamalizes that cornmeal just a tiny bit. And then you're also, or alkalizes it, I should say. It might make it easier for people to understand. But also, you know, and then they're using sheep brain or deer brain or whatever to be the oil for the hot stone that they cook this bread on. You know, it's very simple, 3 ingredients basically right there. Or I grew up with wasna, you know, which we were doing on stage, and it was just pounded meat, usually some dried berries, which were typically choke cherries for where I grew up. And you can add bits and pieces of other things if you want to. So I added a little bit of that ground hominy corn that we had somebody pounding next to us. Something very simple, you know, so just a very few ingredients, right? And just the simplicity of just having like roasted squash soup with just the broth, and it just has so much flavor and sugar, and the smoke from the fire that it's being cooked on. There's already a lot of flavor in some of these foods. So for us, we've been able to create a lot of fun dishes and do a lot of dinners, and, you know, put a lot of artistry onto the plates, but just keeping it super simple. You know, it's just very simple flavors. It's like we're making food taste like where we are. So you could have some sunchoke and some rose hip and some blueberry and some walleye, and you can like just go into a lake right around here and look around and see all those pieces right next to you, you know? So it's just, you know, thinking hyper regionally, like just like what kind of flavors would you see walking through the forest, and being able to express that on a plate, but also tie the importance of those foods and those flavors because of the cultures that had utilized them to survive with for so long.
It's a spiritual journey in some ways, is it not?
It's just that deep connection that Indigenous people share to the earth, you know, like we're just so deeply connected, and there's so much respect that goes into the food. When you're harvesting, you're leaving down prayers and tobaccos. In the old days, they would sing songs as they harvested, very particular songs for the harvest, as a thankfulness, as a prayer, you know, or for us doing our spirit plates, our offering plates at the beginning of every dinner, and just making it a part to thank all of the plants and animals and people that made that meal possible, and all the ancestors and everything, just like being thankful for a moment and being cognizant for a moment of that thankfulness, you know. And it's just a part of, again, like Indigenous peoples from around the globe share that deep respect to the earth and the plants and the food that they're able to get from that.
So much of what we do, we're addicted to, what we eat. I mean, is that part of the problem? Yes. We're addicted to what we know.
Definitely, and we know that a lot of these foods are, you know, purposefully built to be addictive too. On top of that, you know, you look at a lot of fast food. You look at that combination of salt, fat, and sugar, and just like hitting all of those neurons that go off in your brain when you're eating this food, and all the dopamine that happens, right? And you get this little high almost off of those sugary and fatty foods, and they feel good for a moment, but then you don't feel good. Your body tells you shouldn't have ate that whole box of whatever you just ate, right? So for us, nutrition and diet is really the most important thing, and we've found it to be much more impactful, especially working with tribal communities, to talk about traditional indigenous foods and how these foods can actually bring back a lot of health, and then being able to do a dinner with them, showcase them, and then let people see, like, after you eat a big dinner of this really a healthy food base that's particular from the region we're standing on, you just feel more energized and healthy in general. And it's not that we're pushing healthy foods particularly, it's just that the indigenous diets happen to be extremely healthy, and it could be really impactful to get these foods out there.
Driving wealth back into tribal communities, it's a core part of our mission.
For us, we just see a path and we're just taking it. So we see something that can be positive, it could do a lot of good, a lot of impact, and we're not claiming to have all the answers for all the problems of the food systems of the world, but we just happen to see a clear path that can have a lot of impact.
Shawn, it's been a very long day for you, I'm sure, and for you, Dana, and thanks so much for sharing. And we'll,
Our interview with Shawn Sherman and Dana Thompson was originally featured in our story called The Sioux Chef, which aired on PBS NewsHour on October 16, 2019. To check out the full story and a virtual reality experience at an Indigenous Food Expo, go to undertoldstories.org. Coming up, our next few episodes will explore the lethal legacy that landmines leave behind.
If an area is contaminated by landmines, sometimes they just don't have a choice other than to enter that minefield.
And Zola Nene's post-apartheid kitchen.
The fact that we've overcome a lot of those things makes us so much stronger as a country.
You can find every Undertold Verbatim episode, virtual reality 360 experiences, and our entire library of Undertold news reports from around the world at undertoldstories.org. This episode was hosted by me, Solveig Rennan, and produced and edited by Simeon Lancaster. The interview was conducted by our director, Fred DeSam Lazaro. Undertold Verbatim is brought to you by the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. As always, thanks for your support.